From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The algorithms of Google and Facebook are tuned to keep users on site and active, preferably by pressing emotional buttons that reveal each user's true self. For most users, this means content that provokes fear or outrage. Hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories are catnip for these algorithms.
As 47 attorneys general probe Facebook for violating antitrust regulations, we speak with one of Mark Zuckerberg's former mentors, the early Facebook investor Roger McNamee, author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe.
I was just so proud of Facebook. I thought Mark was different. So I was blissfully a fan. I mean, just a huge fan. And I got to the end of my career and I'd retired before I realized there was something wrong.
As Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testifies on Capitol Hill today, we spend the hour with Roger McNamee. All the more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In explosive testimony, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, William Taylor, told congressional lawmakers Tuesday the Trump administration held up $391 million in aid to Ukraine for the purpose of pushing Ukraine to incriminate Trump's political rivals, particularly presidential candidate Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. In Taylor's opening statement, which has been made public, he lays out his interactions with Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, a wealthy Oregon hotel magnate who received the ambassadorship after donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration. Taylor says Ambassador Sondland told him that everything, including security assistance, was dependent on the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announcing an investigation into Burisma, the gas company where Joe Biden's son Hunter was a board member. Taylor said, quote, Ambassador Sondland told me that President Trump had told him that he wants President Zelensky to state publicly that Ukraine will investigate Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. election, unquote. Taylor's testimony offers the most damning evidence so far in the ongoing impeachment inquiry. On Tuesday, amidst Taylor's explosive testimony, President Trump sparked widespread criticism by tweeting that the impeachment inquiry is a lynching. The comment was widely condemned as racist and grossly historically inaccurate. This is Democratic Congressmember Hakeem Jeffries.
Thousands of African Americans were slaughtered during the lynching epidemic in this country for no reason other than the color of their skin. The president should not compare a constitutionally mandated impeachment inquiry to such a dangerous and dark chapter of American history. It's irresponsible for him to do so, and I hope that he will apologize.
The Turkish military has halted its invasion of northern Syria after reaching an agreement with Russia Tuesday that would force Syrian and Kurdish forces to retreat from a wide swath of the Syrian-Turkish border. The deal came after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Sochi, Russia, Tuesday. Russia and Turkey agreed to carry out joint patrols along the Syrian-Turkish border. Thousands of Syrian Kurdish civilians have continued to flee the area and into Iraq amidst the conflict that began after President Trump spoke to Erdogan on the telephone October 6, then abruptly withdrew U.S. troops from the region, clearing the way for the Turkish invasion. This is Kurdish refugee Asad Ismail.
Our houses are still destroyed. People are still displaced. People don't have money. So many people left for other countries.
Convoys of these U.S. troops have been departing northern Syria for western Iraq, where the Pentagon initially said they'd be restationed. But the Iraqi government responded that the U.S. does not have permission to station those troops in Iraq. On Tuesday, Defense Secretary Mark Esper met with the Iraqi defense minister, who says the U.S. troops will leave Iraq within 4 weeks. This is Esper speaking to CNN's Christiane Amanpour.
We're conducting a phased withdrawal, deliberate phased withdrawal from northeast Syria. We will temporarily reposition in Iraq pursuant to bringing the troops home. And so it's just one part of a continuing phase, but eventually those troops are going to come home.
Protests have erupted in Bolivia over claims Sunday's presidential election was rigged in favor of longtime leader Evo Morales. Preliminary election results showed the election headed for a runoff, with Morales leading his opponent, former President Carlos Mesa, with less than the 10% margin required to win the election outright. But then election officials abruptly stopped the ballot count for 24 hours. When the count resumed, Morales had suddenly surged far ahead of Mesa with enough of a lead to avoid a December runoff. Protesters have raided 2 electoral tribunal buildings and burned ballot boxes. The vice president of the Bolivian Supreme Electoral Court has announced his resignation amidst the fraud accusations, and the Organization of American States is meeting today over the situation. Chilean President Sebastián Piñera has announced new reforms aimed at ending weeks of nationwide protests in response to a subway fare hike, rising inequality, high cost of living, and privatization. Piñera vowed Tuesday to increase the basic pension by 20% and proposed a health care law that would mandate the state cover the costs of expensive medical treatments. It's unclear whether the reforms will halt the massive demonstrations. At least 15 people have died. More than 5,000 have been detained since the protests began. Piñera has declared a state of emergency in the capital, Santiago, and 5 other cities, imposing a curfew and sending the military into the streets in response to civil unrest for the first time since dictator Augusto Pinochet's regime. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson lost a critical vote Tuesday in his quest to fast-track a Brexit deal and withdraw Britain from the European Union by October 31st. Johnson's government has now requested a 3-month extension to get Brexit approved by the British Parliament. The President of the European Parliament says he supports the extension. The latest results from the Canadian national elections show Canada's newly formed anti-immigrant party failed to win a single seat in Monday's elections. The People's Party of Canada fielded more than 300 candidates but received only 1.5% of the vote. Even the party's leader, a former Conservative Party politician, lost his parliamentary seat. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held on to power in Monday's tight elections, although his Liberal Party did not win a majority. In Tennessee, a striking United Auto Worker Union member was hit by a car and killed outside the General Motors plant in Spring Hill, where workers were maintaining an active picket line. The UAW said in a statement that 55-year-old union member Roy McCombs, quote, tragically lost his life today on a picket line, standing up for a better life for himself and his co-workers, unquote. The UAW strike is entering its 38th day today. Workers remain on strike as they vote on a tentative agreement between the union and General Motors reached on Saturday. It's the longest national strike at GM by the United Auto Workers in nearly half a century. In Chicago, teachers are heading into their 2nd week of strike as schools remain closed across the city. The teachers are demanding better pay and benefits, smaller class sizes, and more nurses, counselors, social workers, and librarians. Chicago is the nation's 3rd largest school system with more than 350,000 students. On Tuesday, Democratic presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Warren joined the teachers on the picket line.
In America should support you in this strike. And the reason is because when you go out and fight, you don't just fight for yourselves. You fight for the children of this city and the children of this country.
New York State Attorney General Letitia James announced the state's probe of Facebook for violating antitrust regulations, and now backed by attorneys general from 46 other U.S. states and territories. James said the probe is looking at whether Facebook put consumer data at risk, reduce the quality of consumers' choices, and increase the price of advertising. This comes as Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg will be testifying on Capitol Hill today. We'll have more on Facebook after headlines. A 49-year-old Mexican immigrant who was in Border Patrol custody died Monday, reportedly of a pre-existing heart condition. The man, who has not yet been identified, was detained on Sunday afternoon in southern Arizona. He was later taken to a hospital in Tucson, where he was pronounced dead Monday morning. The man is the second immigrant to die while in U.S. custody this month. The first was an immigrant from Cameroon who died under the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. At least 11 other immigrants have died while in Customs and Border Protection custody so far this year. In more news from Arizona, Phoenix Police Chief Jerry Williams has fired the police officer who threatened to shoot an African-American family after their 4-year-old daughter took a doll from a Family Dollar store. The incident was captured in a viral cell phone video that shows Phoenix officer Christopher Meyer, who is white, pointing a gun at the family's car with them inside and threatening to shoot the girl's father, Drayvon Ames, in the face. The girl's mother, Aisha Harper, is heard saying she's unable to hold her hands up because she's holding a baby and that she's pregnant. This is Drayvon Ames speaking to Democracy Now! In June.
I was in the driver's seat, and his interaction with me was he first came to my door. He opened the door, no problem. He tells me to put my hands up. I do that instantly because he has the gun drawn. We don't know who he is. I'm just taking commands from anyone, unidentifiable person at this point. I don't know if I'm being mugged, robbed, or anything. I'm just hands up. I'm not trying to die with my family, so...
To see the full interview, go to democracynow.org. The decision to fire Officer Meyer comes as Phoenix police announced Tuesday the firing of another officer who was involved in a Facebook group that advocated violence against Latinos, Muslims, and women. 95% of baby foods contain either lead, arsenic, mercury, or cadmium. That's according to a shocking new national study by Healthy Babies Bright Futures, which tested 61 different baby food brands purchased across 14 different metropolitan areas, from San Diego, California to Albany, New York. The study found nearly all the baby foods tested were contaminated with at least one of the developmental neurotoxins. 1 in 4 of the tested baby foods contained all 4 types of the heavy metals, which are each linked to IQ loss from exposures early in life. In response to the study, New York Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer is calling on the Federal Drug Administration to examine the study and release a public statement on its findings. In sports news, Major League Baseball is investigating the outburst by Houston Astros assistant general manager Brandon Taubman to 3 female journalists Saturday night as the Astros celebrated their win against the Yankees in Game 6 of the American League Championship Series. Taubman yelled at Sports Illustrated reporter Stephanie Apstein, who was wearing a purple domestic violence awareness bracelet, and other female reporters, quote, "Thank God we got Osuna. I'm so effing glad we got Osuna," unquote. The Astros signed relief pitcher Roberto Osuna from the Toronto Blue Jays in 2018, only weeks after the league handed him a 75-game suspension for violating its domestic violence policy. Osuna is being accused of assaulting the mother of his child. Major League Baseball has launched an investigation into whether the 3 female journalists were subject to a hostile work environment. Boeing has ousted one of its top executives, marking the first high-level management change since the fatal crashes of 2 737 MAX jets that combined killed 346 people. The ousted executive, Kevin McAllister, had led Boeing's commercial airplanes division. The plane crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia have provoked global outrage and sparked questions about the Trump administration's close ties to Boeing. On Monday, Boeing announced it will begin paying out $50 million in financial assistance to the families of the victims of the two crashes. And in New York, 2 members of the far-right hate group, the Proud Boys, have been sentenced to 4 years in prison for attacking a group of anti-fascist protesters outside their Metropolitan Republican Club in Manhattan last year. Proud Boy members Maxwell Hare and John Kinsman were convicted of attempted gang assault, and riot. State Supreme Court Justice Mark Dwyer said the sentencing was intended to deter future violence, saying, quote, "I know enough about history to know what happened in Europe in the 30s when political street brawls were allowed to go ahead without any type of check from the criminal justice system," he said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is testifying today on Capitol Hill as his company's actions face escalating criticism. The focus of today's House hearing is on Facebook's plan to launch a cryptocurrency called Libra that could reshape the world's financial system. Zuckerberg will reportedly tell legislators he supports delaying the launch of Libra until U.S. regulators approve it. According to his prepared remarks, Zuckerberg will say, quote, "I believe this is something that needs to get built, but I understand we're not the ideal messenger right now. I know some people wonder whether we can be trusted to build payment services that protect consumers," he's apparently going to say. Today's hearing comes as Facebook faces intense scrutiny on a number of grounds. On Tuesday, New York Attorney General Letitia James announced that her probe of Facebook for violating antitrust regulations is now backed by attorneys general from 46 other U.S. states and territories. James said the states are, quote, concerned that Facebook may have put consumer data at risk, reduced the quality of consumers' choices, and increase the price of advertising. Facebook is also facing criticism from several Democratic presidential candidates for refusing to ban political ads containing false information. Meanwhile, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has repeatedly called for Facebook and other big tech companies to be broken up on antitrust grounds. Well, today we spend the hour with a man who once mentored Mark Zuckerberg and was an early investor in Facebook, but has since become one of Facebook's most vocal critics. Roger McNamee joins us from Pittsburgh. He's been an investor in Silicon Valley for over 35 years. He's advised Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and many others. Earlier this year, he published the book Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Roger McNamee, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you start off by explaining why you call Facebook a catastrophe?
So, Amy, first of all, thank you very much. It is such a privilege to be here on Democracy Now! With you today. So, Facebook really simply began its life in a very innocent way, connecting friends to friends and allowing people to share what was going on in their lives. The challenge really developed when the company needed to make money, and so it began creating a business model that was based on effectively monopolizing attention. They sell advertising. They need people to watch the ads. And the way they did that was to use two things: the techniques of slot machines and propaganda that prey on the weakest elements of human psychology. And then they used smartphones, which basically were on people's bodies 24 hours a day and created the ability to generate first habits and then later addiction. And Facebook, along with Google and other products like Instagram and YouTube, played this game incredibly effectively. And they did so at a time when there really were no rules for businesses. I mean, essentially, the American economy has been deregulating for 40 years, and so there's nobody watching the store. And smart people take what they can get, and the people at Facebook and Google are really smart. And they basically made a play for a global consumer internet product that would essentially touch everyone around the world and bring them into a single network and manipulate their behavior for profit. And it's been amazingly successful in economic terms, but it's caused huge harms to democracy, to public health, to privacy, and frankly, to the structure of the economy itself. And in my mind, we have a huge challenge because as users, we really like these products. We like Facebook. We like Instagram. We like YouTube. But we have to learn to accept that things we like can sometimes do great harm to society. And that's what's happened, Amy.
Explain its threat to democracy, Roger.
Very simply put, the way that Facebook works, and the same would be true of Instagram and YouTube and Google search engine, they need you to spend a lot of time. And so the first thing they do is they use notifications to build the habit. Once you're addicted, once you're coming back multiple times a day, they have to find ways to keep you on the site. And the simplest way to do that is to reinforce whatever content gets you to share or like or comment. It turns out, for most of us, the content that does that is stuff that triggers flight or fight, which is essentially a part of our psychology that's so deeply wired we can't avoid it. The content that does that best is hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Effectively, what happens on Facebook is they bombard you with the stuff you react to, and it blocks out all other forms of communication. So you wind up being in what is called a filter bubble, which is essentially an artificial reality where everything appears to reinforce the things you already like or the things you already believe. And it blocks out any new ideas. And in a democracy, that's terrible because it increases polarization. Essentially, each one of us is in our own Truman Show. And if we're not careful, we wind up having our own set of facts. And you see this every day. I mean, 1/3 of Americans do not believe there's any relationship between human activity and climate change. That is demonstrably false. There's another 7 or 8% who believe there is a linkage between vaccination and autism, which is clearly not true. Well, in a democracy, if you can't agree on the facts, you can't have debate, you can't have compromise. And Facebook has played a larger role than any other platform at increasing this polarization. They've had a lot of help from YouTube and Instagram, but Facebook has been the one that's done it worst.
And why a threat to public health?
So on public health, there's a bunch of different things going on in public health. Quite obviously, if people live in a fantasy world, if they live in a Truman Show, and they're angry all the time, right? If people are constantly being bombarded with stuff that triggers fear or outrage, that's just not going to be good for their mental health. But let's think about children. You have huge issues on products like Instagram with bullying and body shaming. We've seen a very mysterious but alarming increase in teen suicide, and it has been suggested that there may be a link to social media in terms of increasing that pressure at this very vulnerable time in children's lives. And then, obviously, there are products that Facebook has and that especially Google and Microsoft have. They're aimed at really little kids. So Microsoft has Minecraft, Facebook has Messenger for kids, and Google has Chromebooks and all of their educational products. And those things are designed essentially to train really little kids for this world of surveillance that is so core to the business model of internet platforms.
In a moment, we're going to talk about how you came to know Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, what you said to them, your advice, the direction they're going in today, the significance of his testifying on Capitol Hill, talking also about cryptocurrency. But I just wanted to get your comment on the latest news that 47 states and U.S. territories are now joining with New York investigating Facebook, charging it with antitrust violations.
Well, so, Amy, this is a really important initiative. If you had asked me 2 years ago whether I thought it was likely that we would see antitrust action against Google or Facebook, I would have said it was very, very unlikely. Essentially, the Republican Party has had as a core strategy to dismantle antitrust as one of the government's functions is the arbiter of capitalism. And so we've reduced the opportunities for antitrust to something so small that effectively it appeared that internet platforms like Google and Facebook would be untouchable. In reality, they commit antitrust violations every single day. And the good news is that state attorneys general are in a position to act on this because many states have privacy laws. Many of them have consumer protection laws that these companies have violated every single day. And we see 47 states and territories going after Facebook. We see 50 going after Google. This is incredibly welcome. It's incredibly important. This is the very beginning of a process that's likely to take several years. But in my opinion, this is the most likely antitrust venue to have success in. And I think it's super important that it work because these companies act as though they're not accountable to anybody. And in that context, they do great harm and escape any kind of punishment for it. And that just is wrong.
We're going to break, and when we come back, we want to find out exactly how you got zucked, how you met Mark Zuckerberg, and the evolution of that relationship along with the evolution of Facebook. We're talking to Roger McNamee. He's the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. He's had a 34-year career in Silicon Valley, was an early investor in Facebook. Stay with us. Nothing to Hide by Yola Tango. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue with Roger McNamee, author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. He has had a 34-year career in Silicon Valley, was an early investor in Facebook. So talk about how you met Mark Zuckerberg and talk about the evolution of the company.
So, Amy, when I met Mark, it was in 2006. I had already spent 24 years, nearly half of my life, investing in Silicon Valley. And it was a normal thing for me to be consulted by young entrepreneurs who just wanted some perspective on how Silicon Valley worked. I got an email from one of Mark's colleagues saying, "My boss has a crisis. Would you be willing to take a meeting with him?" I was really excited about the idea because while I could not use Facebook at that time, you had to be a student with an email address from your school. I was convinced Facebook was the next big thing. I was convinced that the requirement that you had to be who you said you were, with authenticated identity from your school email address, and the ability to control who could see your private information, I thought those two things changed everything and would allow Facebook to eventually be bigger than Google was at that time. So I was really excited to meet Mark, and he comes into my office, and I tell this story in the book. I'll give you the very short version of it. I said, "Mark, before you say anything, I've got to tell you why I took this meeting." Because I said, "I think you got the most important thing since Google, but before long, either Microsoft or Yahoo is going to offer $1 billion for Facebook, and everybody you know is going to tell you to take the money. And I'm here to tell you that if you want to see your vision come to fruition, you have to do it yourself." What followed that, Amy, was the most painful 5 minutes of my entire life. Mark, one of his great strengths is he does not act without thinking things through very carefully. And in this particular context, he decided to think about what I said before he reacted. He wanted to decide if he trusted me. But it took 5 minutes, and you know from television how painful silence can be when you're expecting a response from someone. Long story short, it turned out that Yahoo had offered $1 billion, and as I had predicted, everyone told Mark to sell the company, and that was the reason he was there to see me. He wanted to find out how he could keep the company independent. I helped him solve that problem, and for 3 years thereafter, I was one of his mentors. And my role was very narrow, but important to both of us, because everybody in the company wanted to sell out, and so he needed to rebuild his management team. And the most important person that I recommended to him and helped to bring into the company was Sheryl Sandberg. And I'd known Sheryl for a number of years because she'd introduced me to Bono, the U2 lead singer, who was my business partner. He became my business partner after Sheryl introduced him. And so I knew Sheryl really, really well, and I'd helped her get into Google, and we were very close, and I thought she'd be a really good fit for Mark. I thought the two of them would balance each other and provide complementary skills, and for many years that was true.
So talk about when you started to get disillusioned.
So imagine it took place in 2 phases, Amy. The first part of it was I got disillusioned with Silicon Valley. Beginning around 2010, with the financing of Spotify, and then going on to Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, and then Juul, I started to see companies that were clearly the best of what Silicon Valley had to offer, but whose essential being violated my values. That Airbnb and Uber and Lyft were really about breaking the law, that they basically said the law doesn't apply to us. And Spotify was about essentially profiting at the expense of musicians. And Juul, of course, was about addicting young people to nicotine. And I just said, I can't keep investing other people's money if I'm not willing to invest in the best stuff coming out of my community. So I decided it was time for me to retire. And when I made the decision in 2012, my fund still had a few years to run, so I had to wait till it ended. It ended at the end of 2015. And then immediately, January of 2016, in the context of the Democratic primary in New Hampshire, I saw hate speech being circulated from Facebook groups that were notionally associated with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And it was obvious that Bernie had nothing to do with it, but the thing that was also obvious was that the hate speech was spreading so virally that someone had to be spending money to get my friends into these groups. And that really disturbed me. Then I saw civil rights violations relative to Black Lives Matter taking place using the advertising tools of Facebook. But the clincher for me came in June of 2016 with the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. That was the first time that I realized, oh my God, the same advertising tools that make Facebook so useful for a marketer can be used to undermine democracy in an election. That was when I started looking for allies, and I couldn't find any. And eventually, I was given an opportunity to write an opinion piece for the Recode Tech blog to raise my concerns. And before I got finished with it, in early October, the U.S. government announced the Russians were interfering in the election. And at that point, I scrambled to finish the draft, and I sent it to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. I mean, they were my friends. I'd been their mentor. And I was really worried that something about the culture, the business model, and the algorithms of Facebook was allowing bad actors to harm innocent people. And I couldn't believe that Facebook would do this on purpose. And so I went to warn them 9 days before the presidential election. And unfortunately, they treat it like a PR problem, not like a business issue. And they were nice enough in the sense that they had one of their colleagues work with me for 3 months, to let me try to lay out my case. So between basically the end of October of 2016 and February of 2017, I was begging Facebook to do what Johnson & Johnson did after the Tylenol poisoning in Chicago in 1982. The CEO dropped everything. He withdrew every bottle of Tylenol from every retail shelf until they invented tamper-proof packaging. And I thought Facebook should do something like that, should work with the government to find out everything the Russians were doing, to find out every other way the platform was being abused, either to violate civil rights or to undermine democracy. But for whatever reason, maybe I was the wrong messenger, maybe something about the way I delivered the message didn't work. But they didn't take it seriously, and I realized I was faced with a choice. I was so proud of that company, and I've been so closely involved. But I felt like I knew something I had to share with everybody, that I couldn't just sit back and be retired and let it go by. And so I decided to become an activist, which is something I never anticipated doing. And I've spent essentially the last 3 years every day doing nothing but trying to make the world aware of the dark side of internet platforms like Facebook, like Google, and to help people both protect themselves, but to protect their children, to protect democracy, and to protect the economy.
Let me go to Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg speaking during a press call last year, during which he dismissed claims Facebook ignored Russia's election meddling or undermined investigations.
I've said many times before that we were too slow to spot Russian interference, too slow to understand it, and too slow to get on top of it. And we've certainly stumbled along the way. But to suggest that we weren't interested in knowing the truth, or that we wanted to hide what we knew, or that we tried to prevent investigations is simply untrue.
Okay, your response to that?
So I think in Mark's mind, he is doing the right thing. But here's where the problem comes in, Amy. Mark believes that the mission of connecting the whole world on one seamless, frictionless platform is the most important thing anybody can do on Earth, and it justifies any means necessary to get there. I'm sure in his own mind, they felt like they've been open with people, but the reality is quite different. Facebook is designed to be opaque. Google is designed to be opaque. And in a sense, they work together because Google manages all of the infrastructure behind digital advertising, and so they play a role in that whole ecosystem that allows companies like Facebook to prevent anyone from inspecting what's going on. And the truth is, they had to know before the election that there was something really wrong, because I'm sure I was not the only one who brought it to their attention. But at the end of the day, their view of the world is that they should just connect everybody and not be responsible for the consequences. What they told me was, they said, Roger, the law says we're a platform, not a media company. We're not responsible for what third parties do. And I said, Mark, Cheryl, this is a trust business. The law doesn't protect you if your users believe that you're undermining democracy, if they believe that you're harming civil rights, if you're harming public health, if you're harming privacy. There's no protection against that, and that's what we're seeing today. And the issue that I run into is that in 2016, I'm willing to accept that maybe they didn't pick up the right signals. God knows I didn't. But once they were informed, once people like me, once President Obama went to Mark, there was no excuse. And they have clearly spent the entire time since then trying to use misdirection to keep us from seeing what really happened there, denying, deflecting, and delaying any kind of investigation. If they were really sincere about this, they would have shown us every ad the Trump campaign showed on the platform. They would have shown everything that the Russians did. They would have given us all the billing records. They would have done all of that kind of stuff. But they quite clearly haven't done that. And it goes way beyond just elections, right? You have terrorism in Christchurch, New Zealand. You have ethnic cleansing in the Asian country of Myanmar. You have hate speech around the world. You have mass killings in the United States. I mean, all of these things were enabled by internet platforms like Facebook. And they didn't go out of their way to cause them to happen, but they never put in place any safety nets, any firewalls, anything to protect users from the bad actors who are empowered by the way the algorithms and the culture and the business model of Facebook work.
Roger McNamee, I want to turn to Mark Zuckerberg speaking at Georgetown University just last week, where he invoked Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Black Lives Matter movement to argue that attempts to reduce false information on Facebook could censor free speech.
In times of social tension, our impulse is often to pull back on free expression. because we want the progress that comes from free expression, but we don't want the tension. We saw this when Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail where he was unconstitutionally jailed for protesting peacefully. We saw this in the effort to shut down campus protests during the Vietnam War. We saw this way back when America was deeply polarized about its role in World War I, and the Supreme Court ruled at the time that the socialist leader Eugene Debs could be imprisoned for making an anti-war speech. In the end, all of these decisions were wrong. Pulling back on free expression wasn't the answer, and in fact, it often ends up hurting the minority views that we seek to protect.
So that's Mark Zuckerberg. Civil rights leaders quickly criticized his speech. Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, Bernice King, tweeted, quote, "I heard Mark Zuckerberg's free expression speech in which he referenced my father. I'd like to help Facebook better understand the challenges MLK faced from disinformation campaigns launched by politicians. These campaigns created an atmosphere for his assassination," she said. King is reportedly visiting the Facebook headquarters this week. Your response, Roger?
I'm with Bernice, and I got to tell you, I think what Mark said there was horrific. I mean, it was disingenuous. It was not an honest telling either of what Facebook does or of how history worked. Here's the issue. Mark wants us to treat Facebook with respect on First Amendment grounds, that this is an issue of free speech. And here's where the problem comes up. The question that we're talking about here is whether Facebook should be allowed to have falsehoods in political advertising. They had a rule for the longest time that they couldn't have false advertising anywhere. When they were called out on this issue recently, instead of fixing the problem, they changed the rule to say, from now on, we're not going to have fact-checking of political ads. So the question is, does that constitute free speech? Is that about free expression? And I would argue that's not anything at all about that. And the reason is because Facebook ads are micro-targeted. The only people who see them are people who are carefully selected. So in an issue of free speech, if everyone got to see every single ad in a political context, then Mark's statement might have a little bit of viability. But they don't. This is all about organized campaigns designed to manipulate vulnerable populations. And the second problem we have here is that Mark's business, based on advertising, requires him to amplify the most engaging content that people see. And the problem is that the most engaging content on any internet platform is the stuff that triggers flight or fight, our most basic human instinct. Well, in that context, we're really talking about hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And there is no way in God's green earth you can convince me that free expression is aided by the amplification of hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories over facts or over any kind of neutral conversation. I just think everything he's saying is completely self-serving. It's not intellectually honest, and none of us should take it seriously.
On Capitol Hill last year, Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Chris Wiley told the Senate Judiciary Committee that the voter profiling company sought to suppress turnout among African-American voters and preyed on racial biases. Wiley testified that Cambridge Analytica harvested the data of up to 87 million Facebook users without their permission and used the data to, quote, fight a culture war. Cambridge Analytica was founded by billionaire Robert Mercer. Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon of Breitbart News was one of the company's key strategists. Wiley said he left the company due to efforts to disengage voters and target African Americans. This is Chris Wiley.
Cambridge Analytica sought to identify mental vulnerabilities in voters and worked to exploit them by targeting information designed to activate some of the worst characteristics in people, such as neuroticism, paranoia, and racial biases. To be clear, the work of Cambridge Analytica is not equivalent to traditional marketing. Cambridge Analytica specialized in disinformation, spreading rumors, compromat, and propaganda.
So that's Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Chris Wiley testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Roger McNamee, if you can talk about the whole explosive, expose of Cambridge Analytica and its relationship with Facebook and how Zuckerberg dealt with it.
So the thing to understand, Amy, is that Cambridge Analytica was in the political psychological operations business. They were willing to sell their services to anyone, and they sold them in many countries around the world. They essentially had some kind of relationship to the Leave.eu campaign for Brexit in the United Kingdom, and they had a relationship with the Trump campaign, originally with the Ted Cruz campaign, but then the Trump campaign. And their goal was very simple, was to identify groups whose votes could be suppressed. And in the context of the Trump campaign, that was suburban white women, people of color, and idealistic young people. And essentially, the goal was not to convert them from being Clinton voters to being Trump voters, but in fact, to find Clinton voters who could be, with a targeted, micro-targeted, focused campaign, discouraged from voting at all. And it was demonstrably successful. And the thing is, there's no law against it today. The way things are set up, we never anticipated the ability to have the level of addiction that a smartphone would create, and therefore the ease of emotional manipulation that would allow in a political context. Micro-targeting is practiced by Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube in the context of a political campaign is asymmetrical in the most extreme form, because an ethical campaign will not use that kind of technology. Only an unethical campaign will. And so at the end of the day, we're left with this situation where it empowers people who have bad intentions at the expense of democracy itself. And we need to have laws that reflect the impact of technology in our democracy. And that is one of the highest priorities in my mind that Congress should have, both as an election issue in 2020 and then for the period immediately following.
As Mark Zuckerberg goes to Capitol Hill today to testify, we're speaking to Roger McNamee, author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. He was a early investor in Facebook, knew Mark Zuckerberg very well. When we come back, I want to ask you about the presidential candidates and their position on the issues of trust and antitrust and Facebook, what should happen to it and other companies. Stay with us.
Some will climb a mountain in search of what is real. A few will find an answer and swear that it's ideal. But then there are the angry ones who cannot hear. A few will turn to violence and blanket us with fear. Is someone looking out for me, or are there UFOs? Everybody has an opinion, nobody knows. Some who own glass houses throw stones while they shout. They preach a lot to others, often wrong but not in doubt. Is someone looking out for me, or are there UFOs? Everybody has an opinion, but nobody knows.
Nobody Knows by Roger McNamee, our guest for the hour today, author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. I want to go to last week's presidential debate in Ohio. This is debate moderator, New York Times reporter Mark Lacey.
Let's turn to the growing concerns over the power of big tech companies. Mr. Yang, Senator Warren is calling for companies like Facebook, Amazon, and Google to be broken up. Is she right? Does that need to happen?
As usual, Senator Warren is 100% right in diagnosing the problem. There are absolutely excesses in technology, and in some cases, having them divest parts of their business is the right move. But we also have to be realistic that competition doesn't solve all of the problems. It's not like any of us wants to use the fourth best navigation app. That would be like cruel punishment. There's a reason why no one is using Bing today. Sorry, Microsoft, it's true. So it's not like breaking up these big tech companies will revive Main Street businesses around the country. Breaking up the tech companies does nothing to make our kids healthier. What we have to do is we have to home in on the specific problems we're trying to solve and use 21st century solutions for 21st century problems. Using a 20th century antitrust framework will not work. We need new solutions and a new toolkit.
Thank you. Senator Warren, is Mr. Yang wrong? Your response, please.
Look, I'm not willing to give up and let a handful of monopolists dominate our economy and our democracy. It's time to fight back. Think about it this way. When you talk about how it works in competition, about 8%, 9% of all retail sales happen in bricks and sticks stores, happen at Walmart. About 49% of all sales online happen in one place. That's Amazon. It collects information from every little business. And then Amazon does something else. It runs the platform, gets all the information, and then goes into competition with those little businesses. Look, you get to be the umpire in the baseball game, or you get to have a team, but you don't get to do both at the same time. We need to enforce our antitrust laws, break up these giant companies that are dominating big tech, big pharma, big oil, all of them.
So that's Elizabeth Warren, and before that, Andrew Yang. And now I wanted to go to a clip from earlier this month. The technology website The Verge published a leaked audio recording of Mark Zuckerberg saying an Elizabeth Warren presidency would, quote, suck for the company, and that he may sue the U.S. government if it attempts to break up Facebook.
Like Elizabeth Warren, who thinks that the right answer is to break up the companies, if she gets elected president, then I would bet that we will have a legal challenge, and I would bet that we will win the legal challenge. Does that still suck for us? Yeah. I don't have to, have a major lawsuit against our own government. That's not like the position that you want to be in when you're, it's like we care about our country and want to work with our government to do good things. And But look, at the end of the day, if someone's going to try to threaten something that existential, you go to the mat and you fight.
So that's leaked audio recording of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Senator Elizabeth Warren responded on Twitter by writing, quote, what would really suck is if we don't fix a corrupt system that lets giant companies like Facebook engage in illegal, anti-competitive practices, stomp on consumer privacy rights, and repeatedly fumble their responsibility to protect our democracy. Earlier this year, Facebook temporarily took down ads by Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign that called for the breakup of big tech companies, including Facebook. The ads directed supporters to a petition for Warren's antitrust proposal. So, Roger McNamee, respond to all of that.
So, Amy, the first thing to think about is this. In a country as polarized as the United States is, and it's arguably as polarized as it's been since the Civil War, the one issue that seems to cut across the entire political spectrum is this one. People of all political stripes understand that there's a problem here. They may not understand exactly what the problem is or what to do about it, but they recognize that there's something wrong here. And this is really encouraging. So if you're me, you're an activist, I've tried to work with policymakers across the full spectrum. And I've been very fortunate. The Antitrust Division of the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission with Trump appointees have both been surprisingly supportive of looking at antitrust and other regulatory forms here. So that's good. Relative to Congress, I've had lots of people to talk to. Among the people running for president, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar have shown real leadership on this, but particularly Senator Warren. She has identified this issue from before she was a candidate. In the summer of 2017, we had long conversations about this, and I was simply blown away by the depth of her understanding. Senator Klobuchar, though, has a very clear understanding of the antitrust issues. I think she's very committed there. I think Cory Booker is a person who has shown a lot of interest in this, and we're seeing from Senator Sanders now some interest as well. There are a couple candidates who really concern me deeply on the issue. Senator Harris, because she's from California, I think feels a loyalty to Facebook and Google that's kept her from being a leader on this issue. And I'm deeply concerned about the relationship between Mayor Buttigieg and Facebook in particular. You may have seen the story this week that Mark Zuckerberg was surreptitiously helping the Buttigieg campaign hire key personnel. Now, this is going on at precisely the same time that Mark is openly criticizing Senator Warren, and in which Senator Warren has correctly posted ads on Facebook that are mocking Facebook's policy of allowing falsehoods. And I look at this whole thing and I'm deeply concerned because there is a lot of evidence that Facebook and Google, even if they do nothing conscious to affect the outcome, will still have a profound impact because they do amplify the most negative voices in any political struggle more than they amplify the others. In 2016, there was a message sent by a senior Facebook executive to a former employee that said that Trump had a 17-to-1 advantage of reach per dollar spent for his advertising on Facebook over Clinton. Now, some of that was just because they were clever, but 17-to-1, you don't get that just by being clever. A lot of that has to do with the content of the messaging, the fact that it was filled with disinformation, conspiracy theories, and hate speech really helped those messages spread. Not because everybody always liked them, but because it made people angry, and so they shared them a lot. And when I look at this in a political sense, I think that Facebook owes the country more than just its best effort. It actually should be held accountable for the outcome of this election. And in my opinion, if the company fails to protect us in 2020, that we should be open to notions like shutting the platform down. I think the same thing should be true of Google. I mean, these countries had a profound negative effect on democracy, not just in the United States, not just in the United Kingdom, but in Brazil and many other countries. And in my parents' generation, any company that had enabled the Russians to interfere in a U.S. election, I suspect would have been shut down. And it wouldn't shock me if the executives had been criminally prosecuted, because we didn't allow foreign countries to undermine our democracy. And yet these companies seem to think that that's acceptable. And as Americans, we should be better than that.
Let me ask you quickly before the end of this hour, Libra, the cryptocurrency of Facebook, that is why ostensibly Mark Zuckerberg is on Capitol Hill today testifying before the Foreign Services Committee, though I assume they're going to ask a lot more questions than that. Briefly explain that and say what you think Congress members should be asking.
So Libra is a cryptocurrency designed to compete against the dollar, the euro, Swiss franc, and the yen as one of the reserve currencies of the world. It is a terrible idea. When you think about national sovereignty for the United States or any other country, it's based on two things: the control of legitimate force, the military and police, but also on control of currency. If private corporations are allowed to create their own currency that operates globally, what I think you'll see happen is that rich people will move their transactions onto the cryptocurrency so they can escape detection, escape taxation, and escape currency controls. That is so destabilizing for the rest of us. It should not be permitted. And my hope is that the members of Congress will blow up Libra in the first 2 minutes of the hearing and then move on to the dozens of other issues that Facebook should be legitimately forced to answer for.
The most important question, Roger?
In my mind is, Mark, should we allow you to continue to operate if there is any interference at all after 2020?
And are you still invested in Facebook? You were one of its early investors.
So, Amy, I made a conscious choice when I began my activism to hold what remained of my position, which was substantial to me, because I didn't want to be accused of speaking negatively about a stock I'd sold. That was a year and a half ago. I have recently unloaded almost all of my remaining position. There are a few shares left, but I do not want to be a shareholder any longer. And, you know, I think that
we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you very much, Roger McNamee, for joining us, author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. We'll bring you part 2 at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman.